Joined us straight from his panel. Mr. Nichols, early on, you said we need Donald Trump. Perhaps we need Donald Trump right now.
I was cautious about saying that. I write for The Nation magazine, which was not particularly enthusiastic about Mr. Trump's candidacy. And I think what I may have said, if it's a direct quote, was something along the lines of, we might have needed Donald Trump. What I meant by that is that we had fallen into a pattern in this country of trying to deal with huge challenges. Globalization revolution that's changing everything about how we relate to the rest of the world. A digital revolution that's changing everything about how we communicate and interact with one another. An automation revolution that's changing everything about how we work. These are huge issues, and as a country we weren't wrestling with them. And so I think what has happened is that because we weren't wrestling with them, an opening was created for an election result that shocked an awfully lot of Americans, including, I would say, the majority of Americans were shocked by it. And that's what I mean by maybe that shock factor is something that causes a lot of us to engage in much more fundamental questions of what we're going to be as a country, and perhaps to get to the debate that we should have had in 2016, but didn't have because we got so lost in, frankly, an awful lot of what Donald Trump did, which was blaming the other, blaming those who are different, and really creating a politics of reaction rather than a forward-looking politics.
And before we get to calls, one other comment you made that I wanted you to further explain. Yeah. You said that we're about 10 to 15% into this tech revolution or digital revolution.
Yeah. That's a really important thing to understand. In our book, People Get Ready, we write about all the research that's being done, which is very rarely reported and very rarely discussed. And what the people who are doing research on our technological progress, particularly automation, the combination of our digital technologies with robots, with robotification, as well as the industrial leaders, the people that are literally doing it, they all say that we're just at the pivot point now. We're just beginning to figure out what you can do when you attach digital technology to a robot. And the amazing part about it is it can drive your car. We know that. The driverless car is much discussed. But it can also do so much else that 30 to 50% of the jobs that we now have are very likely to disappear in the next 30 to 50 years. And we have to think about that because some of the jobs that will disappear are really central jobs of our society. Truck drivers, cab drivers, people who drive, people who are clerks in stores. But also, in our book, we talk a lot about the fact that things that we think of as very professionalized, architectural drawing, the law, medicine, can and will be robotified or be altered in some fundamental way. People need to be conscious of that. In 2016, we should have had a debate about that. The candidates should have literally stood there and talked about what are we going to do when we have fewer jobs? Will we work less? Will we create a social welfare state? Or will we have guaranteed income? These are huge issues, and I don't propose that we discuss them all in our little half hour here, but what I'm telling you is we missed a profound opportunity in 2016, and that led a lot of voters to look kind of desperately for somebody who seemed to be proposing big change. I think that that's one of the reasons why you saw such interest in Bernie Sanders and in Donald Trump, even though they are the two most different men you will ever meet.
Let's take some calls. Let's hear from Ben in Florence, Massachusetts. Ben, you're on with author John Nichols.
Yeah, thanks. John, I am concerned about discussions like you, but with a different perspective. I'm very attuned to the environment, the nature, and I'm concerned about the pillaging of the earth and the extermination of most other living species. And in that regard, I am mystified why no one talks about population control, and specifically in regards to the medical insurance issue in the United States. And please focus on this. 1 out of every 2 babies being born is paid for with welfare. That's 1 out of every 2 babies. That's gone up from 40% about 10 years ago to over 50% today. And I'd appreciate...
All right, Ben, there's a lot on the table there. John Nichols, we've got medical insurance, population control, the environment.
Well, I think what I take away from our question there is a desire to discuss great, big, and sometimes unsettling and challenging issues. And that's exactly right. We're not doing it enough. We have a crisis in America, and the crisis is rooted both in our media and our politics. Our media has, with the wonderful exception of C-SPAN, become click and ratings driven to such an extent that really good journalists, really sincere people, still worry about, whether their important story or their important report will move to the top of that list of most read. Are
you guilty of that?
Oh yeah, terribly guilty. I check it on our Nation website. And so I know this reality. But sometimes the most important story is the one that never makes that list. And so our media is not doing a good enough job of saying, we've spent a lot of time, a lot of energy on this. We've found an issue that we think really matters, and we're going to, hell or high water, we're going to tell you about it. We're going to really work on it. And our political class is a nightmare zone of people who repeat bromides from 50 years ago and try to, literally Donald Trump's slogan was "Make America Great Again." And the fact of the matter is that when we deal with fundamental issues of climate change, of how we're going to create a system that provides health care to all, of how we are going to make sure that every child that is born gets the care and the support that they need, fundamental questions. I mean, you got to go big on those discussions. And frankly, we had in 2016 a very small and very disappointing election.
John is in San Francisco. Go ahead, John.
Hello, Mr. Nichols, C-SPAN.
Hey.
Yes, my comment is that when you compare the revelations that Donald Trump said about President Obama wiretapping him supposedly, and everybody was screaming around looking, hey, he's not providing any proof. But for about the past 6 months, and certainly even up until the intelligence report came out, everybody has been saying that Russia hacked the United States, but there has been no proof provided. And the report itself said that they were highly confident in some respects. They were mildly confident in other respects. But if you watch Rachel Maddow or almost anybody see CNN, they all forget the caveats. Highly confident. They treat it as if it's a certainty that it happened, and to me that's just bogus, because no proof was provided in the that Trump didn't provide any proof. No proof was provided for that the Russians have ever hacked. And isn't it convenient that, I'm sorry, we can't share that information with you. And then you go back and you see how the DNC, when they were hacked, Donna Brazile just made a total fool of herself time and time again, going out there and saying, oh, well, this is just outrageous, and don't pay attention to it. A guy on
John,
CNN
we'll hear from Mr. Nichols in just a minute, but did you support President Trump in the election?
No, I did not vote for Donald Trump, but I hate hypocrisy. And when I see utter hypocrisy...
Thank you, sir. Let's hear from John Nichols of The Nation.
Well, I take from this call a lot, because this person's put a lot on the table. And we don't have the time to discuss every aspect of questions about Russia, questions about what Donald Trump says that is true or false, all these issues. So let's go to the core of this. And the core of this is something, again, we talk about a lot in our book, which is we've moved into a technological age where we can do things that you used to just talk about in the movies or in spy novels. It is possible to hack. It is possible to monitor what people say. It's much more possible than I think most of our political class and even our media elites talk about. And so this possibility has created dialogues and debates which often fill in the blanks without detail, right? There's an assumption, well, they could have done that, so they probably did. Or they did some of this, they must have done it all. And what I counsel on all this is, let's avoid a new Cold War. We made an awful lot of mistakes in the late 1940s and 1950s at home in this country based on fears that people were doing things that, by the way, turned out to often be false. Joe McCarthy from my home state of Wisconsin used to run around with lists of all the people that were doing horrible things, and it turned out they were laundry lists, not names of people. And so I think we have to have an immense amount of skepticism and caution. By the same token, I think it is a very big deal, huge deal, that Donald Trump claimed apparently without factual basis, that his predecessor had committed a crime. And it is. You can't order spying on a U.S. citizen without justification. There had to be something there. And we do need to examine this, because just as it is wrong to, without proper authorization, spy on American citizens, it is also wrong as the President of the United States to use the bully pulpit of your office, the power of your office, to literally point at someone, even a former president, and suggest that they did something so fundamentally wrong. So Congress should examine this. And frankly, I'd like to see an immense amount of declassification wherever possible on all these reports. Let's instead of speculating and bits and pieces that we hear, let's put as much as we can out there. Let people read it themselves. I genuinely think that that will ease some fears, and frankly, probably up a couple other fears, and that's okay. At least we'll be moving from a place of knowledge rather than speculation.
Connie's in Johnston, South Carolina, and Connie, you're on Book TV with author John Nichols. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks for your comments, Mr. Nichols. I want you to comment on something I heard. I don't know if it's true, but it frightened me if it could be true, that there's a bill that was going through the Arizona legislature that if someone is arrested at a demonstration or even photographed at a demonstration where violence happens, they can apply RICO statutes and take their property just like they do in, say, drug raids and things like that. And for me, you know, I was going to Washington for the Women's March, and then a family issue came up and I couldn't go. But if I thought I was going to be at a place where there might be some violence and photographed and my property taken, it would stop me from going. And I feel like that people are trying, you know, we're trying now to get this, every individual to step forward and do their part. But that's a good way to squelch that if that's true.
Thank you, Connie. A new potential use of technology.
Sure, I love Connie for throwing this question in. Yeah, we write about this in our book, and you know, the fact of the matter is that many cities around the world, less so in the U.S., but in many places around the world, literally do have cameras on every other phone pole or every other building, and so there's an immense amount of monitoring of us. There's also, with drone technology now, monitoring in, you know, even what we would think of as relatively isolated settings, and so we have to recognize this is possible, and this becomes a fundamental constitutional issue. Connie is right. I won't speak to details of an Arizona bill, but I will say there's been a pattern of bills across the country that are unbelievably troublesome. They seek to criminalize dissent. They seek to criminalize protest, or at least to put incredible restrictions on it. This is not something new. It's happened in the past in America, but it's something we have to resist. Our Constitution was written in 1787, and people need to remember, the states said, no, it's not sufficient. You have to add a Bill of Rights. That first item of the Bill of Rights protected your ability to sit here, freedom of the press. It protected my ability to talk to you, freedom of speech. It protected our ability to, you know, sometime this morning go to a church or a mosque or a synagogue if we wanted. But it also protected the right to assemble and to petition for the redress of grievances. That is a core constitutional right. And if laws diminish it, undermine it, put people at risk or fear for dissenting in this country, then that is a violation of the Constitution of the United States, and more importantly, of basic premises of this country, which say that part of our small d democratic system is to allow people to gather together, to raise their voices loud enough, to make the promise of freedom of speech real enough that a great mass of people can raise that voice and maybe make a change. It's an incredibly important thing. These laws that have been proposed are deeply, deeply troubling.
Let's hear from Ken in Melbourne, Florida. Hi, Ken. Go ahead.
Okay, two issues. The first one's small. John Nichols doesn't understand and doesn't use English grammar well. He noted how people in Wisconsin refer to all people as guys. A woman will get up and say, you guys, and to an audience of women. In English, when the masculine form of masculine pronoun is used, it includes the feminine unless the context forbids it. So when the Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal, it means all humans are created equal. And shame on you, John, for not knowing that and not, saying that the language meant only men. You've been infected with political correctness.
The more important issue. What was your second point?
The more important issue is the answer to every. decades
Ken,
ago
go ahead and finish your statement.
In a book called Economics in One Lesson. And think about how farming became industrialized. And almost everybody in the country used to be a farmer. And when farming was industrialized, we didn't need so many farmers. And all these farmers lost their jobs, so to speak. Well, that freed them up to do other things, like invent smartphones and the internet and all the other wonderful stuff we have today. So the answer to John's book was already written decades ago in Henry Hazlitt's book, Economics in One Lesson.
Thank you, sir. Let's hear from John Nichols on grammar and economics.
Oh, well, I do like to have my grammar corrected. I would counsel our caller to go back and look at the place where I was discussing that, in which I suggested that I certainly hope that Thomas Jefferson, when he said all men are created equal, was including women. And so I definitely agree with the point that he is making. I'm glad he makes it with such passion. But I would also counsel that there's some folks who thought that the authorship of the Constitution, some of our founding documents, didn't quite recognize that, because women were, by and large, not allowed to vote. Neither were people of color, a lot of poor folks in places around this country, in some cases, even into the early part of the 19th century, people who were religious dissenters. And so my suggestion is that we've had to struggle toward a recognition of what we really want to mean when we say all men, and I would add all women, are created equal. Now, on the second part, I take this point and I really respect it, because I think people want to believe that technological progress will always produce a great many new jobs. And just as the first industrial revolution moved people from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy, the second industrial revolution moved them from low-level industry to high-level, more automated industry, that we are in another revolution that will create all sorts of new jobs. The only counsel I would give is there's almost nobody who seriously researches this that says that's the case. And there are a few outliers who will say, yeah, I mean, we're going to have jobs like you can't imagine. But by and large, serious researchers will tell us that the machinery that we are creating is, in fact, being created to replace people. It's different than a lot of previous technological progress. And so what we have to understand and start to think about is what we, the people, might do with the technological progress that we were promised would liberate us. If you look back 100 years ago to the writing of William Morris and so many other folks, they will say, well, in the future we'll have all this technology, we'll be able to study poetry and paint and study religion and spend time with our kids and, you know, all these wonderful things. It was a portrait of something very utopian. Now we say, oh no, we'll create some new job. You'll drive Uber all night or something like that. What I'm suggesting is that a moment of this fundamental significance, the changes that are taking place, ought to demand a small d democratic discourse about what we'll do with our time, what we'll do to work, what we will do to sustain ourselves, and, interestingly enough, apropos of a previous caller, how this might actually help us to preserve a planet and to make for a more humane society. These are genuinely debatable questions. And what I will counsel also on our caller there is that in the book we read a lot about the history of how when the Industrial Revolution came, it was at first stunningly inhumane and stunningly demanding. And those who questioned it and challenged it ultimately shaped a far more humane society. We had social progress as a result of a pushing back against technological change. And I would suggest that today we need that pushing back, not to stop it, not to prevent the future, but to say, hold it, we need to think about, you know, whether we really want our kids spending 6-7 hours a day on an iPhone. And if we don't, what are we going to do? How do we alter that? How do we alter education? How do we alter work? These are wonderful debates, exciting, engaging debates. The problem is that our political elites don't tend to engage in them nearly enough.
Paul, Huntington Beach, California. Good morning, go ahead.
Hi, John. Great to talk to you. That was an excellent presentation. You did a wonderful job of setting the stage for a question that I've wanted to speak with you about for several years now. For the last 6 years, I have been writing the content for a website that will do the very things that you talked about. I am looking for someone to partner up with, and I don't want to lose my intellectual property in the process of trying to find who I'm looking for. So I'm asking you, assuming you feel that it's appropriate for you to talk about something like this over the air, Who would you recommend that I try to partner up with to help me implement this website?
I have an answer for you, but I'm not going to give you any business advice because I promise you I am the worst person in the world to come to for business advice. But I will tell you that the folks at the WikiLeaks Foundation, or I apologize, I said WikiLeaks because we're so obsessed with it these days. Folks at the Wikipedia Foundation, the people who oversee Wikipedia, are incredible thinkers on these issues of how to open up discourse, how to, discuss and explore and make real the promise of technological change. I've met with them and I've been blown away by how much they think. They're in San Francisco, and again, I don't speak for them, so maybe they won't thank me for this, but I'd recommend trying to contact them. I think other folks who want to expand the discourse will find a group of folks there who are in a very, very exciting, not-for-profit, small d democratic way interested in doing kind of what C-SPAN tries to do, which is open up discourse and dialogue on big issues. And so that's my answer to your question, but again, with a proviso that I'm not a business counselor.
John Nichols, the subtitle of your book includes the phrase citizenless democracy. What do you mean by that?
I'd say it's what terrifies me the most. When we say a citizenless democracy, a lot of people go to an easy default position. They say, oh, that means people not voting. Now, in the United States, we have very low turnout compared to other industrialized and developed democracies. So I do want higher turnout. I want us to compete with Belgium, where they get up to like 90, 93%, or the Scandinavian countries where they're well into the 80s. And I think that's important, but that's not what we're talking about. What we're really talking about is that there are so many issues that are taken off the table in the United States. We don't discuss a lot of core issues. And often we have elites that tell us, well, that's settled, that's way too complicated for the people to be involved in. That citizens are pushed out of democracy. What happens in that circumstance is one of two things. Either the elites really do get to call all the shots, and in many cases they do in this country, or you create a situation where you've got a pressure cooker, and citizens know that issues aren't being discussed, and they get angrier and angrier, more impassioned and more impassioned, more responsive to a populist appeal. And the classic issue on that is trade. Trade was very poorly discussed in our media, and trade policy was very poorly discussed in a lot of our political elites. As a result, you had this great passion across America, people who felt that globalization wasn't working for them. That eventually exploded into a huge political phenomenon. So when I talk about citizenless democracy, it is the dangerous practice of pushing the people out of the high-profile, big-ticket, vital debates that have to be had. Because I find this very weird thing as I go across the country, and I know you know this from doing this show, the people often have better answers than the politicians.
Alan, Springdale, Utah. Hi, Alan. You're on with author John Nichols.
Hi, thanks. John, you do such a great job. I have a couple of related questions. And the first one, briefly, I grew up in Utah as a conservative Republican, and over the years, reading a lot, I came around to thinking that, at least 70% of what I'd, learned growing up about politics was probably just crap. But, the right does, I like to think they have some points that are, have a certain legitimacy. I mean, there are people who want to mooch and take advantage of social welfare programs. Not nearly as many as the conservatives would have us believe, but we probably don't want a nanny state. A lot of inspectors on every job site making everyone has steel-toed boots and so on. So.
Do you know
First
what,
question
Alan? We've got some more callers on the line, and he's put a couple things.
Oh, I love what Alan's thrown out.
Been thinking about this.
I wrote a book a few years ago called The S Word, and it was about socialism. And everybody thought, well, this is a big argument for socialism. No, what it was an argument for was for democratic discourse. And what I was arguing is that socialism has been part of the American experiment throughout its history. We've had socialists, Eugene Victor Debs, Norman Thomas. Thomas Paine wrote a social democratic treatise, his last essays, Agrarian Justice. And so this has been a part of who we are, and yet we don't acknowledge it. And when we don't acknowledge it, when we push ideas on the left or ideas on the right out of the discourse, we end up with narrow and often dysfunctional answers to our questions because we're not taking in all the potential ideas. Our friends on the right have given us very good ideas, our libertarian friends especially, about how to deal with a drug war, how to deal with mass incarceration, all sorts of issues that I think libertarians have played a very vital role in raising. But so is also true of our social democratic friends who have said that in an age of radical economic change, you may want to have free education, because if education isn't free, people who are very dispossessed can't possibly get the skills and the knowledge to move forward. So in America, what we desperately need is a great big debate with great big ideas and a lot of ideology and a lot of politics. And the fact is, my trauma, my fear, is that we have too much trivia, too little real politics, and I want our debates to be bigger, bolder, and much more complicated and difficult. And I want C-SPAN to have to create 2 more channels.
You mentioned Norman Thomas. In a panel or two, one of the author panels, his grandson, Evan Thomas, will be speaking on freedom of the press. So we'll be carrying that live as well. We've got 1 minute, Howard, in St. Cloud, Florida. You have 30 seconds, and we'll give John Nichols 30 seconds.
Thank you. I've been reading Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism. I'm concerned about the philosophy of free market capitalism as enumerated by Ryan. Will lead to the extinction of humanity through the climate change, all to serve capitalism.
I'm glad you've given me 30 seconds to sort this out. Look, here's the bottom line. I think that Paul Ryan, who comes from my home state of Wisconsin, and I've known in various settings, not well, but over a long time, is not out to destroy the world. But I do think that he has a lot of ideas that are poorly developed, and I think that the healthcare plan that they just put out is a mess, and it is a mess because it goes back to the previous question. It doesn't take in big ideas from other places that have worked, and we have to do more of that.
John Nichols is the co-author of this book, People Get Ready, The Fight Against a Jobless Economy and a Citizenless Democracy. Thank you for being on Book TV.
Pleasure.
And Book TV continues our live coverage of the Tucson Festival of Books. It's held on the campus of the University of Arizona. We're inside at the Gallagher Theater, but outside there's approximately